Welcome back. American actor and singer Jussie Smollett, best known for his time on the hit Fox series Empire, was found guilty on 5 counts for filing a false police report amid accusations he staged a hate crime. Before we jump into this conversation, let's take a look at this clip.
I am innocent, and I am not suicidal. If I did this, then it means that I stuck my fist in the fears of Black Americans in this country for over 400 years and the fears of the LGBTQ community. Your Honor, I respect you and I respect the jury, but I did not do this, and I am not suicidal. And if anything happens to me when I go in there, I did not do it to myself, and you must all know that.
Joining me to discuss the sentencing is Jodi Morales of the law office of Jodi Morales. Jodi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, as we saw, Smollett recently received a sentence for making false reports to police that he was the victim of a hate crime in January 2019. It's been 3 years since this case went viral. I'd first like to know, why do high-profile cases like this take so long in court?
Sure. So these types of high-profile trials demand a lot more from jurors than other cases do. As you can imagine, they last for weeks, months. They attract a lot of attention from the media. They expose jurors to all types of threats and emotional stress sometimes. And at times, jurors are even put into longer periods of isolation while they're deliberating with their fellow jurors. So that's one aspect of this. That's one aspect of why it took so long. But I want you to be cognizant of the fact that even though it feels like a long time, this really is the average for most cases to get to trial um, across the country, both because there's a large backlog of cases and a limited number of courtrooms, and also a limited number of judges to hear the cases. Also, what comes into play is that defense attorneys have to utilize time to prepare. Sometimes discovery is not turned over in an appropriate and timely fashion. And all of that factors in to why certain cases, particularly these types of cases, take so long to come to trial.
Now, he received a sentence of 30 months of felony probation, including 150 days in jail, and ordered to pay restitution of more than $120,000 and a $25,000 fine. Many people have mixed opinions on this outcome, but I want to know, how do judges come up with appropriate sentences for those who are guilty?
Sure. So there are sentencing guidelines across the country. Each state has their own different set of rules. In this particular case, however, the judge did take into account aggravating factors. So it's a combination of what is the appropriate sentencing range for this particular crime, as well as the factors that made the crime sort of worse in the judge's perception. In this particular case, we were dealing with a judge, what's his name, Judge James Lynn, who spoke for about 30 minutes before announcing the sentence. And, I remember he mentioned something about the actors scripting and picking the actors for this hoax. He called this a hoax. And he also mentioned that in his view, it was premeditated. All of those things taken together equal this aggravating factor and why the judge ultimately gave him the sentence that he gave him.
Now,
Now,
I have my
I have
opinions on this, and I think everybody does. But do you think this verdict is actually fair based on the crime? I think from outsiders, it's like, whoa, that's a lot. Like, all that money and that time. Do you think it's actually fair?
I think it's a bit of a hefty sentence for somebody who's never been in trouble before, who's in the public eye, who's actually done a lot by way of community service. He does have a history of that. But what I think factored in here was the judge signaling deterrence. The judge was saying to everybody, this is not going to be accepted or acceptable in my courtroom, in this community, and at large. At least based on the verdict, he's guilty. And so the sentence here has to reflect how I guess astounding the verdict was in this case, given the circumstances and all of the the premeditation that led to this crime.
Now, we can't ignore the fact that Smollett is a public figure. How often does a person's social status affect a possible verdict?
I think, again, we're talking about deterrence and perhaps making an example out of someone who is in the public eye. I think the judge in this case did not want to come across as being lenient or, giving a favor to someone just because he's an actor. And so I think that, the fact that he's a public figure hurt him in this case. It made it so that the judge could use him as, the litmus test for what is acceptable and what is not with these types of cases.
Oh, I really like that point of view because it's so different from what we typically hear. Now, in regards to this case, is staging a hate crime actually against the law? And I guess the same question goes for falsifying police reports.
Well, yeah, I mean, we saw that he was prosecuted for staging this crime. I mean, essentially, um, falsifying reports, pretending that something happened to you when it didn't happen to you. It's all a misrepresentation to law enforcement, to prosecutors, to the public. And so that's why I think that this case took on so much attention. In addition to the fact that he's a public figure, but this is something that we don't see very often, and it is something that is enforceable and totally, able to be prosecuted. So, to answer the question, yes. And I think that again, the court wanted to make an example out of this to deter anyone else from doing a similar act.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for sharing that because that was something I actually didn't even know before this case came
Mhm.
about. So, if you take a look at your screen, a Twitter user by the name of Fred T. Joseph wrote, Jussie Smollett received more than George Zimmerman and nearly everyone who tried to overthrow the government on January 6th. People often make these comparisons in court cases, but is it actually fair to make those comparisons, or is there something that regular people outside of the court don't know?
Yeah, I don't ever think that it's fair to make those comparisons. Again, we're looking at cases in different states, in different jurisdictions, right? And so we can't really measure disparity across different sentencing systems. Um, you have to take into consideration the crime, the person, the sentencing range, the laws in that particular state and how they're to be administered. So it really isn't fair to kind of compare this case to those other cases, which were egregious. Of course they were, but the factors of the case are very much a part of the calculus when these cases are brought before the jury.
Now, I also feel that the tweet was alluding to racial or sexual orientation discrimination. And we also see that Jussie, when he was in the room, was saying, speaking about his identity. Is it fair to conclude that Smollett, as a member of the LGBT community and a person of color, could be experiencing some sort of discrimination in any way?
Well, I mean, historically, right, Black LGBT hate crime victims have always struggled to be believed, right? And there's a certain undercurrent of that in this case. Um, but I think this case really did come down to the credibility of Mr. Smollett. I think that the facts did not line up in his favor. He did not do a really good job of testifying in his own defense. I think he exposed himself to cross examination that highlighted and actually amplified a lot of the issues with the timeline that he told people back when this allegedly happened to him. So of course, again, there is an undercurrent. This is not to minimize at all who he is and how that plays a part in the decision making. But if we're just taking the case at facts and its face value and what was presented in the courtroom, I think that's really why we got the outcome that we did.
Now, how do you think Smollett's actions negatively impact how the court and law enforcement handles future hate crimes? And I guess ones that maybe actually happen or just in general.
I mean, I don't think that this is going to lessen efforts to, prosecute or to, bring people to justice who are committing hate crimes. I think, especially now in New York City, I mean, hate crimes have just skyrocketed, particularly against Asians. And I think that right now, the time it's just a ripe time for courts and prosecutors to hone in on making sure that these types of crimes don't happen in the future. I think also we've got a lot of community organizations who are bringing even more awareness to hate crimes and working together with law enforcement in order to make sure that these hate crimes stop. I know of one organization, it's called They Can't Burn Us All in New York City, that's really spearheading a lot of efforts to make sure that these types of crimes are not happening. So I think community pressure, I think, work by law enforcement, as well as, the types of decisions we see from judges when it comes to sentencing and hate crimes, all of that together is going to sort of strengthen. I don't think it's going to be weakened by the outcome of this case.
So we have just about a minute left. I want to know your thoughts and opinions on just people further educating themselves on our social and justice system, because I do think that everyone has an opinion and it's easy to come to certain conclusions. How do you suggest people actually learn more about the court system?
I think people have to look at the penal code in their state. They need to familiarize themselves with what types of actions are, crimes, and what types of actions are okay, right? Too many of us don't know what is expected of us and what we're allowed to do. And I also think that familiarizing oneself with sentencing is another important component of educating oneself. It's there's a saying that goes, ignorance of the law is not a defense, and that is one of the truisms that I have always adhered to, and I've always kind of promoted to younger people. That is not something that you can sort of use and to get out of trouble, say, oh, I didn't know. So starting with the statutes and really understanding what constitute a crime, I think that's the best place to begin.
Jodi, thank you so much for joining me. If everyone could take a look at their screen, you could see her social media where you can actually learn a little bit more and stay up to date with her. Once again, thank you so much for educating me and having this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks again.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.